Hello, dear viewer. I hope you've already subscribed by clicking the bell so you don't miss new parts or new stories. Enjoy the story, and of course have fun watching it. Dig 2 Graves. Chapter 5. I put the gear selector in park and turn off the ignition. The low background noise of the radio and engine fades into the darkness, replaced by the silence of the car. I look over at her, sitting nervously in the passenger seat. We haven't spoken a word since she got into my car. I seriously question whether or not I should agree to this trip to a small hill overlooking Austin. I'm reminded of how quickly the last 6 months have flown by. It was a trip to hell and back, a train ride called heartbreak. My first decision was to break up with everything I knew in Dallas and move back to Austin and the University of Texas. I knew that the details of my and Susie's breakup would eventually leak out into the gossip-hungry lawyer world revolving around Dallas. There was no way I could survive in that sad environment. It was like the Old West. I had to get out of town. At UT, I was gladly accepted as a guest lecturer at the end of the semester. Austin wasn't far enough away to avoid the gossip coming from Dallas, but the more liberal environment of academia was more forgiving than I would have encountered up north. Just last week, the dean of the law school offered me a full-time position, and I immediately accepted. I was very proud of how well Christy had handled my role at my former firm. I seemed to have trained her well, and I was pleased to see her flourish on her own. Because of how well I tutored Christy, the idea of teaching full-time has become appealing to me, and I am more than ready for a change. I think teaching will be a much more fulfilling endeavor. I don't think I'll miss the corporate world, and I'm certainly not short on funds. In my divorce from Susie, we divided our joint assets equally. But since the house was mine before the marriage, I retained full ownership since I contributed that value to the marriage. In addition, Susie refused to receive any of my severance pay from my former firm. At the time, I would have fought her to the last penny, so I was surprised when they didn't fight over $6 million. Now, 6 months later, looking back, I realized that the anger at Susie has largely faded. Our divorce was slowly making its way through the Texas court system. Susie was not contesting the financial settlement part of our divorce, but she was contesting the divorce itself. She wanted us to go through counseling, and she was able to convince the judge hearing our case to agree to this. However, Bill was able to get the marriage counseling to be limited to 6 hours. Since I had moved to Austin, the logistics of attending counseling became difficult, as it required someone to travel a bit. With the help of our attorneys, we arranged for 3 monthly sessions of 2 hours each. The first 2 sessions were held in Dallas with a counselor of her choice. The third and final session was here in Austin with a counselor of my choice. Susie wasn't thrilled about the division of counselors, but she really had no choice. The judge did not stipulate how the counselors would be chosen, only a mandatory 6 hours and report to the court. She knew, as I did, that if she challenged the decision, the judge would find the 2-1 ratio in her favor more than fair. The outcome of the first 2 sessions I couldn't have predicted better. The counselor was a woman, and all 4 hours were spent in storytelling. I sat and listened in silence about how women are suppressed from childhood. How this early suppression of their spirit leads to unexpected surges in their lives. Mini revolutions, so to speak. It was all I could do not to laugh when the counselor tried to justify Susie's behavior. It wasn't counseling, it was rationalization. After both sessions in Dallas, Susie tried to get me to stay after the session to socialize and even invited me to stay at her house. After moving to Austin, I quickly put my old house on the market and was pleased with how quickly it sold and at the price I wanted. Both times when Susie offered to let me stay, I politely declined, and without further conversation, I took the long drive to Austin that same evening. Tonight was the 3rd and final counseling session. I knew she would have trouble finding the counselor's office, so I arranged to meet her at the LBJ library and drive her there. Susie looked depressed and resigned when I picked her up from the library. The farce of the first 2 consultations turned out to be nothing more than an attempt to justify her behavior and to get me to forgive her and begin reconciliation. I almost laughed at her surprise when she saw that I had chosen a female counselor. She didn't yet know how difficult the night would turn out to be. But in the end, I was more surprised than Susie at how the session went. It was the last session on the counselor's schedule, starting at 7 p.m. It was to last only 2 hours, after which I was to be free, having fulfilled the last condition necessary for a divorce. We didn't leave the counselor's office until after 10. Before tonight, I had already met with a counselor. I see her regularly, and she was already familiar with the situation from my perspective. She also knew all about the first 2 farces in counseling, although the word farce is my descriptor, not hers. 5 minutes into the session, I realized that something was clearly wrong. My counselor told Susie that she knew everything about our relationship, from when we were students to now. She told Susie that she had heard my point of view, and now she wanted to hear Susie's side of the story. Wasting no time, she started asking questions. Unlike previous counseling sessions, and to my surprise, Susie made no attempt to defend herself or her actions. She didn't brush off any of the questions. At one point, I got the impression that Susie realized that it was over, and she no longer had to hide her emotions. I watched in amazement as my hard-headed, dominant ex-wife surrendered to my counselor. Over the next 3+ hours, we all learned a lot. In the time I've known Susie, she has never had a father in her life. Early on in our relationship, I realized that this was a touchy and taboo subject. I accepted her feelings and never broached the subject. It was also obvious that although she loved her mother, she had little respect for her and had little or no relationship with her. Even to a dullard like me, it was obvious that Susie had matured early and learned to take charge of her life. I learned how her father controlled her mother. He threatened to date other women if she did not provide him with sexual favors. Dependent on him, Susie watched her mother obey his requests, even if those requests required her to go to bed with other men. I listened, as Susie described one night from her childhood when she was supposedly locked in her room. Instead, she hid in the closet of her parents' bedroom. At the time, she didn't realize what she saw that night, but later guessed that 2 strangers her father brought home were having sex with her mother. It was her own father's voice warning her mother that she had better swallow. Her father had not kept his promise not to cheat either. Late that night, Susie heard the sounds of other women in the house, as well as her mother's crying. She heard her father telling her mother that she was being punished for not doing what he had asked her to do. Then the beatings began. Susie never saw the marks on her mother, but she heard them at night. Only later did Susie learn that her father knew how to beat her mother so that no marks were left, at least none that would be visible on her clothes. It wasn't until her father began to show interest in Susie that her mother sprang into action. One day, coming home from school, Susie found all her clothes packed in boxes and grocery bags in the back of a department store. She was only 10 years old, but she knew exactly what was going on. I had to think about what kind of childhood Susie had when I heard Susie say that she remembered looking out the window of the department store as her house disappeared, hoping she would never see it again. How hard must a child's childhood be for them to want to never see their home? Susie made a promise to herself to never let anyone hurt her or her mother again. In high school, she rarely dated. Although she was considered attractive, few people asked her out. Susie couldn't tolerate any of her infrequent suitors even talking to another girl. She lost her virginity between her senior year of high school and college. This was news to me, as she said Bill was her first. He was a highway construction worker. He stopped her when she was standing at the construction site. Her car was first in line, and he made casual conversation with her. She didn't know why, but she was immediately attracted to his rugged appearance, his unshaven face, even his dusty, dirty clothes. She refused to give him her phone number, but agreed to take his. A week later, she called him after being pulled over at yet another construction site. She remembered how horny she'd gotten, and trembling called him closer to evening. They chatted for only a few minutes, after which he suggested she go to a bar with him the next night. She agreed, and he hung up, telling her where to meet him. She remembered that she'd spent hours deciding what to wear. When she parked at the bar, she was shivering. She entered the bar without difficulty and found him laughing at a table with a few guys. He saw her and invited her to come over. She suddenly realized they didn't even know each other's names. He bought her a drink while he and the other men talked to her and asked her questions. After she had her second drink, she felt a little sick, and he asked if she needed some air. She gratefully agreed, and before she realized what was happening, she was in his car, parked on a country road. She remembers being shocked when he pulled his buddy out of his pants. She refused to go on with it. She remembers the contemptuous look on his face as he shoved it back into his pants. He started the car and asked her what she was doing here with him, if she hadn't come for a loving moment. Startled, she looked up at him and pulled up her dress, revealing that she wasn't wearing any panties. The only thing she said was, "I'm still a virgin." According to Susie, they did it 3 times that night, after which he drove her back to the bar and dropped her off from the car. According to Susie, that began a long string of nights, 3 or 4 times a week, when she would sneak out of the house to meet him. She knew he was married, though he didn't wear a ring. There was very little conversation. She remembers that he always wanted to do it twice with her. She would always ask him to put on a condom, and he would refuse. It was like a game they played every time they were together. At the end of the summer, she told him she was going away to college. There was another not-so-pleasant scene, which she didn't like, and afterward, he took her back to the car, and she drove home. That was the last night she saw him. She realized she was out of control, but even worse was that she suddenly began to see him as her father. He'd stopped calling her after she'd said no several times. She had dated occasionally during her freshman year at the University of Texas, she said, but nothing serious and no more than a few dates. Susie paused for a moment and looked away. She said quietly that she remembered Tim Schmidt and that he had pestered her for dates, but she had always turned him down. Her infrequent dates changed when she met Bill. She immediately realized that he was a little different from the other guys in college. He seemed more mature and wasn't so concerned with male image. He was sensitive and fun. When they talked, he would look her in the eye and she knew he understood her words before she even said them. They had been dating for several years and intimate for most of that time. The counselor asked Susie if she had ever given fellatio to Bill. Susie shook her head. "I remember looking at the counselor cheerfully, but she didn't even pay attention to me." Susie continued her story and told how they got engaged in their senior year and celebrated when they were both accepted into law school. It all ended the day Susie saw Bill with his sister. Mistaking Bill's sister for another friend, Susie immediately broke off her engagement and relationship with Bill. She didn't give him a chance to explain himself, rejecting all attempts at communication. Almost a year later, in law school, I got up to speed. Both Bill and Susie were in my class. I knew even then that there was something going on between them, but since I had graduated from SMU, I wasn't privy to their history and didn't really listen to the gossip. At first, we were just casual acquaintances. Gradually, we became friends and eventually started dating. During all this time, she never dated anyone else. Our relationship only became serious in our final year of law school. Upon graduation, we both decided to move to Dallas and live together. 2 years later, we were married. Then the counselor asked Susie at length about her summer with the construction worker. I listened intently to what Susie was saying, but I never understood what she saw in this guy. It was obvious to me that he was a badass from the beginning. He treated her with contempt. He treated her like a piece of meat. After what her father had done to her mother, it was incomprehensible to me why she would date someone like that, even if he never forced her to. My counselor also spent a lot of time asking questions about our marriage and ultimately how it ended when she got together with that bastard Schmidt. She pointed out how we had both failed each other in the marriage. She pieced together from what Susie had told her this evening and what I had told her in previous counseling sessions. And in the course of the discussion, several things came to light that even a dullard like me finally realized. Susie, for all her outward toughness, was deeply insecure and vulnerable. She never truly gave of herself, always leaving a part of herself to fall back on in case she was hurt, and she expected to be hurt. In her mind, it was only a matter of time before she was betrayed and hurt. I understood all of that, but even by the end of the session, it still wasn't clear to me why she wanted to go out with Schmidt. Okay, I could understand that it was revenge for what she thought had happened between Heidi and me, but Schmidt? He's a disgusting asshole, and she didn't need to know my opinion to realize that. And humiliate me the way she did? I have learned probably more about Susie in this counseling session than I have in all the years of our marriage. I'm a little afraid of what that might say about the kind of husband I've been to her. But in any case, like that first night in the hotel room after I was ambushed by Schmidt and Susie, I'm left with more questions than answers. When we finally left the counselor's office, Susie did one thing that made me flinch. That single act made me rethink everything I had been thinking about for the past 6 months. She asked my counselor if she could come back and meet with her herself. Once outside, I immediately asked her how she was going to endure this long commute from Dallas to her counselor. She looked right at me and told me that she was already planning to move here to Austin. I asked her if she was doing this because she wanted to keep trying to reconcile. She looked away and replied that she understood that I would never forgive her. She went on to say that she understood one of the reasons I left Dallas so quickly. After the shit hit the fan, she was forced to resign from her position as an assistant prosecutor. She took the only position she could find, public defender. She didn't like that side of the law, she said, and the stigma of what happened still haunts her in all circles, both professional and social. I asked if she had a job, and she said she had cashed in her services and thought she could get a job as an assistant state attorney general. I asked if she needed a place to stay for the evening. She said she planned to come back in the evening. I shrugged and said that she had lost an extra 90 minutes and had a long drive ahead of her. She said she hadn't brought any other clothes with her. I shrugged again and said that wasn't a serious excuse. She said it probably was, and then asked what I was going to say. I paused for a moment, and she turned and looked at me. I told her I guess I was going to ask her if she wanted to sleep on my couch. She smiled and said she appreciated the offer and was willing to take it. As we drove back to LBJ to pick up her car, we stopped first at Starbucks, and then I somehow agreed to drive up here on this climb. Now I'm looking at Susie, who is staring serenely out the windshield. I've always loved the view of the campus from here, Susie finally says. I hummed in agreement. A lot has been said today, she says, looking at me. Yes, it was. I learned a lot. Me too, she says, silent for a moment. Your counselor is much better than the one I chose. Is there anything you'd like to ask me? Finally, she speaks. I look down at her. I wanted to know a million things, but I wasn't sure if I should even touch this Pandora's box, much less open it. She sighs. If you want to know something, now is the time to ask. God knows you deserve an answer or two. I sigh. I look at her, then out the window. Finally, I ask, why? That's a very vague question, she replies softly. At first it was revenge, she says after a few long minutes. I was so incredibly angry, and the funny thing is, I didn't realize why I was so angry. A lot had gone out of our marriage in that last year because we were both more interested in our careers than in each other. When I thought you had cheated, I should have just walked away. I didn't realize why I was so angry until tonight. I'd like to blame it on Schmidt, but I'd be lying to both of us. It wasn't until today that I realized Schmidt reminded me of that construction worker all along. When he called me the afternoon you flew home, I didn't know why. He insisted it was important and that it had to do with you. I agreed to carve out some time and meet in his car outside our house. He told me about the rumors in the office. He showed me the affidavit. He showed me the pictures. I was instantly angry. No, I was furious. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him I didn't know, but one thing was for sure. I wouldn't sleep with him anymore. He offered me revenge. I remember looking out the passenger window, trying not to cry. I asked him what kind of revenge. He replied, that kind. I turned to see his buddy peeking out of his fly, and he was stroking it. I remembered 3 things clearly. He was well-packed, he was very hard, and judging by his smile, he fully expected me to take advantage of the situation. He just smiled at me and I looked at him. I asked him if he thought I should make love to him to get back at you. He nodded affirmatively. I remember smiling at this obvious ploy. I knew he was playing me, but I let him do it. When I was in Schmidt's car, I remember I didn't even check to make sure it was clean. I just leaned over and took it in my mouth. So that was your second time? I ask in surprise. To suck a man all the way? She asks. I nod. Yes and no. He didn't give me a chance. I didn't actually want to stop, but he made me. I remember looking at him questioningly. He smiled and said I should get in the car and he would follow me home. I didn't bother to argue. I even hurried the short distance so we could get home as quickly as possible. I remember looking at my watch as we pulled into our driveway. I knew your plane was already on its way to DFW. When I opened the garage door, I was surprised he pulled in with me, but then I realized it was a smart move so the neighbors wouldn't see. I was already ready to make love to him before I ran into you. He followed me into the house, carrying a bag. I took his hand and led him into our bedroom. I imagined you making love to Heidi on our bed, and I wanted to get even. I got down on my knees and did what he asked. He asked me how much I wanted revenge. I answered that more than anything. He asked how far I was willing to go. I replied that as far as necessary. He asked if I was sure. I replied that I was absolutely. Then he laid out his plan. He showed me the negligee he wanted me to wear. How I will seduce you. How I will put you in the chair. How he would then make love to me and leave. I'm ashamed to admit that the rest of the plan was mine, Jake. I was on my knees on our bedroom floor, listening to his plans and coming up with even more insidious plans, even better ways to hurt you. It was my idea to put the chair down and have him do it right over your face. What you were supposed to lick out of me wasn't planned. It only occurred to me at the last minute. I think, at least I hope, that if I had thought it through, I wouldn't have talked you into doing it. My only excuse is that I was overwhelmed by my own anger. Oh God, Jake, I was so angry. I remember the look on Schmidt's face when I undressed in front of him and put on the negligee. I remember the look on his face when I knelt in front of him and he put both hands behind my head. I remember the look on your face when I took your flowers and kissed you. I remember how angry you got when you found out Schmidt was there, and I fed off your anger. The angrier you got, the more I enjoyed the anger I felt for you, and then I hurt you so badly. I'm so sorry, Jake. I understand if you can't find a way to forgive me. Susie starts to cry. I'm sorry, Jake, she repeats. Okay, I kind of understand what revenge is. Even if it was wrong and misguided, I get it. I even understand how you and him did it. Especially since I know he organized a lot of shit beforehand. What I don't understand is why you continued with him. You made love to him while I was in the hospital. You made love to him even when the evidence of my so-called affair fell apart. Why? The first night was revenge. I don't justify the rest. I don't really understand it myself. I didn't even want to take you to the hospital. I just wanted to kick you out of the house and hope you died in the street. It was Schmidt who got a little worried when you didn't regain consciousness and insisted we take you to the hospital. I didn't care at that point, but I agreed. Even after we got you to the hospital, I was still too angry to care about you. We returned home, where he continued to make love to me all night. I remember that I eventually fell asleep from exhaustion. He looked at me so much that I wanted to be his night butterfly. The rest of the day was a blur. I was trapped in this world where I was so angry with you, and I was his night butterfly. I remember after lunch we took a break, and I wondered if I should call the hospital. He told me that he had asked his friend from the police to check on you, because he thought you might be getting rowdy. He said you had already checked out of the hospital and were staying at a hotel downtown. I didn't realize until our last meeting a few days later that everything he told me was a lie. Anyway, when he told me that you had been released from the hospital, I started thinking about our accounts. It was just as easy to transfer the money and cancel the cards. I had no trouble getting the judge to sign the TRO, even on Saturday. Schmidt said he would make sure it was served, and I let him. But, shh, she interrupts. Let me finish. You asked why. I'm trying to tell you. I'm trying to tell you everything, even if it's something I don't think you want to know. It's just... She fell silent, hesitating. I knew it was over between us, she begins again. I knew I would never listen to your excuses, even though I probably did every day, didn't I? I knew that nothing would ever save our marriage again. I knew I'd never forgive you. And to top it all off, there was this bad boy. Tonight I realized that Schmidt really reminded me of a construction worker. I knew he only wanted one thing, and by giving him that, I'd also be pissing you off. I was tired of the same old predictability. I wanted something different. I wanted something risky. He was a bad boy. He wanted me to be a bad girl. He made me want to be a bad girl. I lean back in my chair. I feel the anger from 6 months ago rising from my center like bile. It makes me want to scream at her. I count to 10, then 20. A few minutes pass in silence. Can I ask a few questions? She raises her eyes to me again, anticipation written all over her face. The day Schmidt called you into his office for lunch, what happened? Susie turns and looks at me, then snorts with laughter. I look at her in surprise. Sorry, you'll have to forgive me for laughing, she says, but it was the only good thing that happened all week. After a few moments, she stops laughing and then sighs heavily. By then, she continues, I knew Schmidt had set me up. I hadn't admitted it to you yet because I had no idea how I could apologize. How can you apologize after what I did to you? I admit I was intrigued by what he might have wanted. I knew it wasn't lunch. Of course he knew that the little facade he'd built was starting to crumble fast, just as fast as our marriage had that Friday night. So I went to see him. I stopped at his receptionist's desk and she told me I could go in. When I entered Schmidt's office, he was standing at his desk. He smiled at me and gestured for me to kneel at his feet. I almost laughed, but instead I just smiled, closed the door behind me, and locked it. When I walked up to Schmidt, he was smiling almost as wide as I was. I really regretted not wearing heels. Although the point came in handy, unfortunately the shoe came off my foot on contact with his groin, so I don't think he got the full force of my blow. I still remember the look on his face as he slowly sank to his knees. I walked over to where my shoe had flown and put it back on my foot as Schmidt collapsed to the floor. Then I went back to him and leaned over him and whispered to him never to call me again. Then I unlocked his door and closed it behind me. Susie stifled another laugh. Sorry, I probably shouldn't laugh at something like that. If it's about Schmidt, feel free. I paused before continuing. You just mentioned that you already knew when Schmidt called you into his office that he was setting you up. You were always so cold and unforgiving when Bill and I met with you and Vicky. When did you start to suspect that you had been duped? Susie stares straight out the windshield. Jake, that Wednesday morning when we met, you effectively shattered every belief I had desperately clung to. To admit to myself that I'd been duped would have meant admitting that everything I'd done not out of revenge, but as a criminal. My lame claim to righteousness was that everything I did out of revenge, as if that were a really good reason. When you took that away from me, what was I left with? That I was suddenly a cheater? That I'd ruined my marriage? That I was a night butterfly? That I was no better than one of my father's night butterflies? Or worse, as bad as my mother? No, I couldn't accept that. But you made me. By Wednesday, I could no longer refute what my mind was clinging to. But in answer to your question, I seriously doubted all the evidence I had as early as Tuesday. But even earlier, on Monday morning, I exposed Schmidt's first lie. One of the police lieutenants caught me in my office almost immediately after you left. He had a partially completed police report of your assault as recorded at the hospital. The police officers who investigated the report at the hospital quickly realized that your wife was one of the ADAs and discreetly passed it to the lieutenant up the chain of command. He asked me what I wanted to do with the police report. I asked him if you volunteered any information indicating that a crime had been committed. He replied that he had not. I told him not to worry about it and to drop the matter. I returned the police report to him, but did not immediately notice that it indicated that you had left the hospital on Sunday. Schmidt told me you checked out Saturday morning. Despite all your claims of innocence on Monday morning, it was the first domino to fall that broke my resolve. Okay, then if you had serious doubts Tuesday morning, how could you meet with him Tuesday night? I asked with desperation. There was silence in the car. I knew you'd ask that question eventually. I don't have a good answer for you, Jake, or at least an answer that would make you feel any better. I've already told you that I knew our marriage was over. But by Tuesday night, I realized that our marriage was over not because of what you did, but because of what I did. I knew it didn't matter anymore. So why was I with him Tuesday night? Because, Jake, I wanted to. Not so much with him specifically, but with anyone who would make me do something delightful. After all, I didn't have a marriage to prevent it anymore. I take my gaze away from her face and join her, looking out the windshield. I consider asking her if she's still trying to fulfill her need to be decadent, but decide that's not what I want to know. After a few more minutes of silence, Susie says, "Can I ask you a question?" I turn to look at her. Sure, but there's no guarantee I'll answer. What happened to Schmidt? I stared at her for a moment. What makes you think I know anything about this piece of shit? Because I know you. I know you wouldn't let him get away with what he did, any more than you let me get away with it. I smile, looking back through the windshield. One of the nice things about having free funds is that they are actually free. Let's say, hypothetically, someone with lots of spare cash hires a private investigator to follow a piece of shit. And suppose that every time that piece of shit tries to get a job, that someone passes on some inside information to the HR director so that the director knows that the piece of shit is really a piece of shit. So, the last I heard from this piece of shit is that he can get a job anywhere, and so far that hasn't been confirmed. And finally, let's just say that this piece of shit has exhausted all of his own spare cash and is now selling things off to survive. I see, Susie said. And hypothetically, how long would a private investigator keep tabs on what a piece of shit is doing? Shrugging his shoulders. Hypothetically, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of available funds. What about us? Asked Susie. We? Parroted I. I mean, have you ever seen it so we can… I turned to face her after her open-ended question. If you're asking if we'll ever make up, the answer is no. It took me 6 months to get in that car and have a normal conversation. I know that, Jake, she says. I'm not asking for reconciliation, but have you ever seen us be friends? Maybe? I turn back to the front of the car and turn the key in the ignition. Forever is a very long time, Susie. For today, let's content ourselves with being civil. Tomorrow will be another day, and who knows what awaits each of us. I think your idea of continuing to see a counselor is a good idea. Someday, you will meet someone who will make you feel special again, I reply, as I put the gear selector into drive and take my foot off the brake. Well, here is the end of this, in my opinion, a very entertaining story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like along with a bell.